Hello, Sarah. My name is Josseline Gomez, and she is my partner, Zeneyda. Today, we are going to do some questions about education in United States. And now, with my partner, with the first question.
Nice to meet you. Good morning, Sarah. My name is Zeneyda. I have a question for you. Um, how does culture influence the teaching style? For example, more participatory or more authoritarian in your country of United States?
An interesting question. I think, are you interested more in university teaching or in like younger children?
Like
High school.
young people, college, high school.
Okay. Well, I think that in theory, the idea is supposed to be participatory. There is a lot of talk about things like what we call the flipped classroom. That's where we try to get students to participate a lot. In other words, the idea that the professor or the teacher just stands there and lectures is not something that is considered a good way to teach, because the students get bored, they don't pay attention. Also, we believe it's very important to foster critical thinking, and a student isn't going to be thinking critically if they're just writing down what you're saying and they're not actually being asked questions. So I think in the United States right now, the ideal is that all teachers try to do like what I did in the class today, ask a lot of questions, try to get the students to think about things, not just memorize, do activities in the classroom. That's very popular. Maybe show like a video, a YouTube video, for example, and then say, let's talk about this video, what did you see, etc. But so I think that's what most high schools and even universities, they think most professors are supposed to be doing that, or teachers. Not everyone does it though, because in some subjects, for example, I don't know, maybe there are some subjects like, I don't want to blame certain subjects, but where the professor thinks it's more just you got to memorize a lot of information, and so they still just stand up there and just talk and put a lot of things on the board. But I don't think, but that's not considered to be the best type of education these days. Often those are professors who are kind of older, that's the way they were taught, so they still do it. But the younger generation, we are very much encouraged to try to get the students to participate as much as possible. Form groups, for example, maybe give an activity and you form small groups. Yeah, and everybody work in a group and that kind of thing.
It's interesting. And it's equal here in Costa Rica.
Same.
The students participate in different activities.
Right.
And
In some cases, the students don't want to participate and don't want to pay attention.
Yeah, right. That's the challenge, right? Here.
Well, the second question is, what are the main differences that you can see between the U.S. education system and those other countries?
And other countries, like all other countries, or
Any country?
I can't. It's hard to answer that question because I haven't been in schools in many countries. Here, for example, here at this university, it seems very similar to the United States, at least the way. But of course, that's also just because I see Esteban's classes. I don't know if that's. Maybe you guys could tell me if he teaches differently from other people. I have been in the classroom of younger children, like 5th, 6th grade, in Guatemala. And the difference, I don't know if this was a difference because of a different educational philosophy, or if it was more just a difference of these tended to be very poor schools. So there were a lot of kids in the room. It was the school itself, the walls, you could hear the class next door. It was very loud. It was very hard, I think, for the teacher to get the kids to pay attention because there were so many noises going on. But I think that had more to do with logistics, right? Like the school itself just wasn't, the building literally was very hard for the teacher to work with. I'm told that in Japan, we have, in my university, at Soka University, we have a lot of students from Japan. And they tell us, the students, that in their schools, they are not supposed to talk. They are never asked questions. They just, the professor or the teacher just talks and they write. And they then take an exam. They don't write essays. They just memorize. They're not supposed to challenge the teacher if they say something they don't agree with. They keep quiet. Boys sit on one side of the room. Girls sit on the other side of the room. Girls do not engage in sports. Boys do. So I haven't seen it myself because I haven't been in a school in Japan, but that's what the Japanese students tell us. So I think that's also very different, right?
Okay.
And another question is, what is the importance in the physical and mental health in education in the United States?
Well, I mean, we recognize it as a problem, especially after COVID, after the pandemic. But even before then, in high schools, for example, there's a lot of stress because students are trying to get the highest grades they can to go to college, to get into the best colleges. So I don't know here how it works, but in the United States, you get into college based on your grades in high school, plus an exam that you take called the SAT. And if you play sports, you need to excel in sports because sports can get you a scholarship. So you have students who take very hard classes, work really hard in their classes, and they might play 2 or 3 sports, which takes a lot of time, to practice, go to the games, and so on. And then they're trying to get, everybody wants to go to, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, the big important schools. So I think that causes a lot of stress for a lot of students. And I don't honestly see that public schools, are doing anything about that. If anything, they're just making that stress worse, right? Because the schools also want those kids to go to those important schools because it looks good for the school too, right? But when the pandemic hit, I think that was when more people began to understand that, mental health is really important. That a lot of kids were really suffering from the usual stresses, but also because of, being at home. And not every student has a good study environment. So maybe at school they're able to, study and whatever, but when they go home, maybe there's a lot of people living in the house, or there's a situation of violence, or they have to work, a job, or whatever, right? And so I think a lot of that became very obvious, more obvious than usual during the pandemic, when people faced that. So now I think there's a lot of stress on mental health in the schools.
In the professor attend some problem of one student in your country, for example, or
The professor.
The professor helps to the students when they need psychological.
Most likely it's not the professor, but hopefully the professor recognizes the problem, sees that the student is struggling, and then we have counselors. So people in the schools whose job is to help the students. I guess it depends on the professor. The professor or the teacher might have the ability and time to help the student directly.
Yes.
But a lot of times the classes are really big. We have a big problem in the US that you have one teacher has 4 classes, 40 students each. So like 160 students. So it's very hard for them to really deal with each student as an individual. Yeah, in a smaller school you can do that, but in a big school, and that's normal. In the US, we have very large schools with overcrowding, honestly. And then there's the issue of money. You know, if the school doesn't have enough counselors, then that can also be, a challenge. Even if the teacher says, hey, I see a student who's having a problem, the student should go talk to the counselor, but maybe the counselor also doesn't have time because the school district is poor. The way our schools work is the tax, people pay taxes on their homes, right? Mm-hmm. And that tax money goes to the district where the people live. So if I live in a poor neighborhood and I don't pay very much taxes, then my school also doesn't receive very much money. Mm-hmm. Rich people pay a lot of taxes, so a lot of their schools get a lot of money. That's the way it works in the United States. So if you live in a poor neighborhood, your school is going to be poor. Mm-hmm. And the school might not have enough money to pay a lot of teachers, enough counselors. Some schools in the United States are really dangerous. Mm-hmm. And they also have to hire guards to make sure students are not going in with guns or other weapons. So, yeah, it really depends on the neighborhood that you live in. Rich people have nice schools. Poor people do not have nice schools. That's the way it works in the U.S., yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, the last question is about the perception of time. Is how does the American perception of time as efficiency, punctuality, or meeting deadline, how all these things influence in the education system?
Well, we have rules about, if you get to class late. It depends on the professor at university. But in a high school, for example, you have to be in the classroom on time. When there's a bell that rings, you have to be in your classroom. If you're late, more than, I don't know, it depends on the school district. They'll say let's say you're late 10 times, then you fail the class. Yeah. Or if you're absent, right? But also being late can be counted as an absent. Different schools have different rules, but that's really, it's a big deal for us. Mm-hmm. We don't walk into class late. I mean, people do, but they get punished for it. Yeah. Deadlines as far as turning in assignments. Again, I mean, most schools believe very, very strongly in deadlines, and some teachers are very rigid about it, They'll fail you if you don't turn it in. Some of them are more relaxed. It sort of depends on the teacher. I think in general, we're supposed to be rigid about deadlines, but again, you recognize that, especially again, after COVID, a lot of people got a lot more flexible with deadlines because we realized that people had all kinds of different situations. I had students during COVID when we were teaching online living in Africa, in Rwanda, and they had to log in at 3 in the morning because of the time zone differences, And so I can't, if this student is late, I mean, what am I going to say? This student got up at 3 in the morning to attend the class, So I think a lot of that rigidity was sort of altered by COVID, right? We understood all the differences. But, generally, gringos have a reputation for being on time. We like things to happen on time. Yeah.
Well,
to conclude this interview, we appreciate your time for sharing your knowledge. It is very important for us as students to learn about different culture, for example, in the United States. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.